The night was carved in silence, the kind that pressed against your chest and made every sound sharper, heavier. On a stretch of highway that cut through open farmland, the hum of Michael Carter's black SUV was the only noise filling the dark. The dashboard clock blinked past midnight, each red digit glowing faintly, as though even time itself had slowed to watch what was about to unfold. Behind him, headlights had been trailing for miles. At first, he brushed it off as coincidence, just another driver on a long night road. But then came the flicker of red and blue, cutting through the darkness like predators' eyes. They weren't a warning, they were a promise. Michael pulled to the shoulder, the gravel crunching beneath his tires. His chest tightened, not from guilt, but from knowing exactly what those lights meant for a man like him. He sat still for a moment, letting his breathing find its rhythm, his hands gripping the wheel in a way that made his knuckles pale. He'd seen this movie too many times. He knew the script, even when he wasn't the one writing it. The cruiser door slammed shut, slicing through the silence. Heavy boots struck the asphalt with a rhythm that carried arrogance, not duty. A flashlight beam stabbed through the driver's window, blinding Michael momentarily. "License and registration," the cop barked, his voice laced with hostility. Michael squinted against the light. "Officer, may I ask why?" "Don't ask questions," the cop snapped, his tone sharp, dripping with the kind of power that wasn't earned, only taken. "License. Now." Michael nodded slowly, his movements deliberate. Both hands visible, he reached toward the center console. His training ran through his veins like second nature. Never sudden, never careless. He pulled out his wallet, sliding his license free. But there was something else there, folded neatly, stamped with a seal that carried more weight than any flashlight or badge could. The officer snatched the license first, his jaw tight, his eyes squinting at the name. Then he noticed the second document, golden insignia gleaming in the night. He blinked, confused, his grip faltering. "That," Michael said, his voice low but steady, "is a federal warrant. I am a United States Marshal." His gaze didn't waver. "And you just stopped the wrong man tonight." The flashlight trembled. The officer's swagger cracked for the first time, his silence louder than any insult he could have thrown. And in that stillness, Michael felt the shift. The road, the badge, the silence of the night, it all tilted in his favor. But this wasn't the end of the story. No, this was the spark, the moment that would unravel reputations, ignite fear in those who hid behind their uniforms, and force the world to confront a truth it had long ignored. Because one man's silence could be crushed, but one man's warrant, that could bring down an empire. Hours before the flashing lights had chased him down, Michael Carter had been standing in a crowded federal courthouse, his dark suit pressed, his badge heavy against his chest pocket. The room had been thick with tension, not the ordinary kind of tension that came with a court ruling, but the kind that lingered in the air when corruption was about to be exposed. Michael wasn't just any man in uniform. At 38, he had carved his life into service, years of discipline and sacrifice written in the lines of his face. He had served first as a soldier, then as a police officer, and eventually, when the corruption became too deep to ignore, he chose to rise above it, becoming a United States Marshal. For him, justice wasn't a slogan. It was a scar carved into his soul, a promise he had made to his younger brother who never made it past 17. Darius Carter. The name alone was enough to set Michael's jaw tight. His younger brother had been bright, funny, restless in the way that only teenagers could be. But one night, in the wrong place at the wrong time, Darius had been stopped by local police, accused of stealing a phone he never touched. The encounter had ended with sirens, a crowd, and Darius's body on the pavement. Michael had watched the city bury another black boy, his brother, beneath headlines that painted him as a suspect instead of a son. That was the day Michael knew he couldn't just wear a badge. He had to wield it. He had to bend it into something that worked not for power, but for truth. And in the years since, every case, every warrant he signed, every fugitive he brought in, it was all for Darius. For every boy who didn't live long enough to see justice. But justice was messy, and Michael's path had left him marked. The same officers who saluted him in public cursed his name in private. His reputation as a man who didn't play politics but played by the law made him dangerous. Tonight's warrant was no different. It wasn't a simple paper with signatures. It was a hammer aimed at the foundation of a police department that had for years operated above the law. Officers who planted evidence, who brutalized communities, who built their careers on silence and fear. Michael had been working with a team of federal agents for months, building the case brick by brick until the walls were ready to come down. Tonight, that folded paper in his console was more than a warrant. It was the storm they had been dreading. And yet, Michael knew storms always had eyes, moments of quiet before destruction. His quiet moment had been stolen the second those red and blue lights flickered behind him. At home, his wife Vanessa had warned him. She always did. Her voice echoed in his head as he sat in the SUV. Don't go out there alone at night. You know how they look at you. He could still see her in their kitchen that morning, her hand resting protectively on the swell of her belly. 7 months pregnant, glowing and exhausted all at once. Vanessa was his anchor. She never asked him to stop fighting, but she always asked him to come back alive. His daughter, Layla, had been the one to slip his badge into his jacket pocket before he left, her little fingers clutching it like it was a shield. She was 6, curious, with the same bright eyes her uncle once had. When she asked him why he worked so late, why he missed bedtime sometimes, he always told her, "Daddy is making sure the world is fair." She never understood the weight of those words, but one day she would. Now, as he sat on the shoulder of a deserted highway, the weight of family and justice pressed against him in equal measure. The cop standing outside his door didn't see any of that. He didn't see the man who had bled for this country, or the brother who had buried his own blood, or the father whose little girl believed in him. All he saw was a black man in a black SUV, and that was enough to fuel his suspicion. Michael kept his hand steady on the wheel as the officer stared at the warrant again, his brow furrowed in disbelief. Another cruiser pulled up behind the first, its headlights spilling over the pavement like floodlights on a stage. A second officer stepped out, his hand already brushing the holster at his side. This was no longer routine. This was the storm. Michael's heart pounded, not from fear for himself, but from the knowledge of what was at stake. He couldn't let them derail what had taken months to build. Too many lives depended on what was in that folded paper. Too many families were waiting for the truth to crack the walls of silence. He thought of Darius again, the way his mother had cried at the funeral, the way Vanessa had stood beside him even then, promising they'd build a life stronger than grief. He thought of Layla, sleeping at home with her favorite stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, safe for now. And he thought of the officers, these men who thought the road was theirs, who thought a badge was armor against accountability. Michael shifted in his seat, his eyes steady, his voice calm. "You should call your captain," he said, his words deliberate like pulling a pin from a grenade. "Tell him Carter is here. He'll know exactly what that means." The officers exchanged a glance, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. The balance of power, once so comfortably in their hands, began to tip. The air on the highway was no longer still. It was charged, electric, alive with the weight of what was coming. Michael knew one thing for certain. Tonight wouldn't end on the shoulder of a highway. Tonight would ripple through courtrooms, through precincts, through the very foundation of justice. And whether he walked away in chains or with his head high, the world would remember the night a black man handed a cop more than his license. He handed him the truth. The night felt heavier than it should have, as though the stars themselves had gone silent, waiting for the outcome of what was unfolding on that lonely stretch of highway. Michael Carter sat still inside the SUV, his hands firmly on the wheel, the faint hum of the engine the only sound between the sharp barks of authority from the two officers outside. The first officer, Simmons, his name tag caught in the glare of the cruiser's lights, gripped the warrant tighter than he should have, as though the paper itself might burn him if he let it slip. His partner, a younger cop with a shaved head and nervous energy vibrating off him, shifted uneasily, his hand never far from his holster. "What kind of game you playing here?" Simmons finally snapped, holding up the folded paper as though it were nothing more than a receipt. "You expect me to believe this?" Michael didn't move, didn't break eye contact. His voice was calm, low, the kind of voice honed by years of de-escalation, yet laced with iron. That's not a game, officer. That's a federal warrant. Signed, sealed, delivered, and you're obstructing its execution. The younger cop scoffed, but there was hesitation there. He shifted his weight, glanced at Simmons, then back at Michael. The balance was fragile, teetering on the edge. Michael could feel the air pressing down on him, each breath tighter than the last. He'd been here before, in different uniforms, in different places. Afghanistan, where roadside checks were ambushes waiting to happen. In Chicago, where a routine stop could turn deadly in seconds. But this wasn't a war zone. This was his country, his home. That should have made it safer. It didn't. Behind them, another cruiser pulled up. The third car. Its lights sliced across the asphalt like red and blue blades, painting Michael's SUV in a strobe of judgment. A third officer stepped out, older, broad-shouldered, his presence immediately shifting the energy. Lieutenant Harris. Michael recognized him, and Harris recognized Michael too. That flash of recognition lasted only a second before Harris's expression hardened, his jaw tightening like a man trying to decide which side of history he wanted to stand on. Marshal Carter, Harris said flatly, striding toward the SUV. The younger officers stiffened at the name, their heads snapping toward him. Harris didn't raise his voice, but it carried weight. Step out of the vehicle. Michael's grip tightened on the wheel. Every instinct screamed against it, not because he was afraid, but because he knew what stepping out meant. Vulnerability, hands off the wheel, a man, his size, his skin, his presence. It would take less than a breath for one nervous twitch of a trigger to turn this night into tragedy. I'll step out, Michael said slowly. When one of you radios this in, call the captain or the U.S. Attorney's Office. They'll confirm what you're holding isn't a piece of fiction. Simmons sneered. You think we're just going to let you waltz around with some forged papers, claiming to be above the law? You're lucky we don't drag you out now and... Harris, Michael cut in sharply, ignoring Simmons. His eyes locked on the lieutenants. You know what this is. You know what I'm here for. The silence that followed was deafening. The younger cop's hand twitched near his holster. Simmons's face twisted with anger, but there was something else creeping in. Fear. And Harris. Harris just stood there, his shoulders rising and falling, the weight of 1,000 decisions pressing on him. Michael thought of Vanessa, of Layla, of the unborn child who might grow up never knowing their father if this night turned wrong. He thought of Darius, of the promise carved into his bones. This was bigger than him, bigger than this road. The radio on Harris's shoulder crackled suddenly, shattering the silence. A dispatcher's voice, clipped and neutral. Unit 3, status check. Harris hesitated, then slowly reached for the radio. His thumb hovered over the button. And then, as though the world had chosen to conspire, the sharp roar of engines filled the air. From the horizon came headlights, bright, blinding, too many to count. At first, Michael thought it was more backup, more cruisers closing in. But as the rumble grew louder, deeper, heavier, realization struck him like thunder. These weren't squad cars. A convoy of military transport trucks rolled down the highway, their green-painted hulks glowing under the streetlights, soldiers visible in the back. Armored Humvees followed, their tires crunching the gravel. It was the National Guard, and at the center of the convoy, in the lead vehicle, sat a figure Michael would know anywhere. His mother. Evelyn Carter, her face framed by the flicker of passing lights, her posture regal even at 62. She had spent her life as a civil rights activist, a woman whose voice had rattled city halls and whose marches had carved history into the pavement. And tonight, she wasn't just a mother. She was a force. The convoy slowed, surrounding the scene like an iron curtain. Soldiers dismounted, boots striking the pavement in unison, their presence a wall of authority that dwarfed the flashing cruisers. The officers froze, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of a force larger than them. Simmons dropped the warrant, his mouth opening and closing like a man suddenly stripped of language. Michael finally opened his door, stepping out slowly, deliberately, his hands visible, his frame towering, but composed. The soldiers didn't flinch. They knew who he was. They were here for him. Evelyn descended from the Humvee, her steps steady, her eyes sharp as steel. When she reached the edge of the scene, she didn't look at the officers. She looked at her son. "You all right, baby?" she asked softly, her voice carrying more power than a siren. Michael nodded, his throat tight. "I'm fine, Mama." Only then did she turn her gaze to the officers, her voice slicing through the night like a blade. "Do you know what you're holding?" she demanded, pointing to the warrant lying at Simmons's feet. "Do you understand what happens to men who stand in the way of justice?" The younger cop stumbled back, his hand dropping from his holster. Harris's face was pale, his authority draining away under the weight of what was unfolding. Simmons, red-faced, bent down to pick up the paper, his fingers trembling. Michael stepped closer, his voice calm but unyielding. "You had a choice tonight, to follow the law or to follow your fear, and the world is watching which one you chose." The soldiers stood silent, a living wall. The convoy's engines hummed like a heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. For the first time, the officers seemed to realize they weren't the hunters tonight. They were the hunted. And though the night wasn't over, though the fight ahead would be long and bloody in the courts and headlines, Michael felt the shift. The rising tide of justice had come crashing onto that lonely highway, and there was no turning it back. The night was no longer quiet. The air itself seemed to tremble beneath the growl of military engines and the uneven breathing of men who suddenly realized they had lost control of the battlefield they thought was theirs. The flashing red and blue lights, once symbols of unchecked authority, were swallowed whole by the green-painted steel of the National Guard convoy. Lieutenant Harris stood frozen, his jaw tight, his hand still hovering near his radio. Sweat glistened at his temple despite the cool air, his silence speaking louder than any order he could give. Simmons, face flushed, gripped the warrant so hard the paper began to crumple in his hands. The younger officer looked like a mom caught in a fire he himself had set but no longer knew how to contain. Michael Carter, his chest rising and falling with steady control, stepped fully out of his SUV. The sudden quiet of his movement was louder than shouting. He stood tall, not just as a man, but as a presence, his dark silhouette outlined against the headlights and the stars. The soldiers behind her adjusted their stances, boots thudding against asphalt in unison, the sound echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. Simmons finally snapped. "This is insane!" His voice cracked, a man fraying at the edges. He jabbed the warrant toward Michael, spittle flying. "You think you can just roll up with soldiers, with trucks, and bully us into believing your story? This is America, damn it. We don't answer to—" Michael cut him off, his voice thunderous yet steady. "You don't answer to me, Simmons. You answer to the law. And tonight the law came knocking." The younger officer flinched as Michael took a step forward. Simmons's hand twitched toward his holster. For half a second, the world hung in balance. Soldiers shifted, their weapons angled just enough to remind the cops they were outnumbered, outmatched, and out of their depth. Lieutenant Harris barked, "Stand down!" His voice cracked like a whip, slicing the tension in two. Simmons froze mid-motion, his chest heaving. The younger cop's hand fell limp at his side, eyes darting between Harris and the rows of soldiers. Michael bent, slowly, deliberately, and picked up the warrant from the ground. He smoothed its crumpled edges with care, as though restoring dignity to something desecrated. Then he held it up in the beam of a cruiser's headlights, his voice rising for all to hear. "This is a federal order," he declared, each syllable striking like a hammer on steel. "Signed by Judge Harriet Cole, mandating the arrest of 3 officers within this very precinct. Tonight you obstructed that order. You profiled me, you threatened me, and now you stand exposed, not before me, but before the nation that will see this." Somewhere in the convoy, a camera light flicked on, then another. Soldiers, journalists embedded with them, civil rights allies, phones and cameras rose like an army of eyes recording everything. Evelyn stepped closer, her face fierce. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked, her words directed at Harris, but meant for all 3 officers. "You've written yourselves into history tonight. The question is, do you want to be remembered as men who clung to hate or men who stepped aside for justice?" For a long moment, silence reigned. Only the low rumble of idling engines filled the void. Michael could see Harris's chest rise and fall, the war playing out inside him. He wasn't blind. He knew the warrant was real. He knew Michael was who he said he was, but pride and fear wrapped around him like chains. Finally, Harris reached for his radio. The static popped as he pressed the button. His voice, tight but controlled, spilled into the air. "Dispatch, this is Unit 3, confirming federal warrant execution in progress. Stand down all local units." The words fell like stones into water, rippling outward. Simmons's mouth fell open in disbelief, his fists trembling. The younger officer looked as though the ground had opened beneath him. Michael lowered the warrant, his eyes never leaving Harris. "That's the first right choice you've made tonight." But Simmons wasn't done. Rage twisted his features, the humiliation clawing at him like fire. "This isn't over," he roared, his voice cracking under the weight of defeat. He pointed a shaking finger at Michael. "You think you're untouchable? You think the badge makes you a god? You're nothing but—" "Enough," Michael's voice silenced him. He stepped closer until Simmons was forced to take a step back. "You almost made tonight a tragedy. And for what? Ego? Hate? Fear? Look at me, Simmons. I'm still standing. And tomorrow you'll answer not to me, but to the people you swore to serve." The soldier's boots struck the pavement again in unison, a sound that swallowed Simmons's sputtering protests. Evelyn placed a hand on her son's shoulder, grounding him, steadying him. In that moment, Michael felt the full weight of it, not just the warrant, not just the confrontation, but the shift of power, the turning tide. For the first time that night, it was not he who stood on trial. It was them. The climax had come. The hunters were unmasked. The hunted was unbreakable. And justice, for once, stood taller than fear. The engines of the convoy slowly quieted as orders crackled through radios, instructing the remaining local units to pull back. One by one, the sirens cut out, their piercing cries dissolving into the night until all that remained was the low hum of diesel and the heavy silence of a world recalibrating itself. Michael stood at the center of it all, sweat on his brow, warrant in hand, his breath coming steady now that the storm had passed. The soldier's boots shuffled in controlled precision, forming a protective perimeter, while townspeople, drawn from their homes by the noise, gathered at the edges of the scene. Some whispered, some simply stared. But all of them knew they had witnessed something irreversible. Evelyn, her voice lower now, but no less firm, leaned into her son's ear. "Remember this, Michael. Justice doesn't arrive when you expect it. It arrives when you stand so tall that injustice can no longer cast a shadow over you." Michael nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. He wasn't just relieved to be alive, he was aware of the weight he now carried. Tonight wasn't just about his survival, it was about accountability, about truth, about showing that even in a world that often bent against them, a crack had appeared in the walls of power. Across from him, Simmons seethed in silence, his anger hollow now, stripped of its armor. Harris stood rigid, shoulders squared but eyes heavy, the look of a man who understood that history had shifted and left him behind. The younger officer, once so eager to dominate, seemed lost, his gaze fixed on the asphalt as though wishing it would swallow him whole. The soldiers began leading the three officers toward a convoy truck, their silence more damning than chains. Phones lifted higher among the crowd, capturing every second, ensuring no lie could be spun come morning. A boy in the crowd, no older than 13, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama," he whispered, pointing at Michael, "is he a hero?" The woman's eyes glistened as she watched Michael steady himself, standing tall against the flashing lights. "No, baby," she said softly. "He's proof." The words landed heavier than any applause. Proof that resilience was not futile. Proof that power could bend. Proof that even when the night was darkest, someone could strike a match bright enough to force shadows back. Michael finally turned, his eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, he locked eyes with the boy. He gave the faintest nod, not a boast, but a promise. Later, as the paperwork began and the convoy rolled the disgraced officers into custody, Evelyn and Michael sat on the hood of his SUV, the night air cool against their skin. Neither spoke at first. The silence between them was its own kind of language. Finally, Evelyn broke it. You know what tomorrow brings, don't you? Michael exhaled. Headlines, investigations, noise. And responsibility, Evelyn added, placing her hand over his. You stood tonight not just for yourself, but for everyone who ever prayed for justice and never saw it come. That means something. Michael stared at the horizon where the faintest glow of dawn hinted at the edge of the world. Then I can't let it end here, he said quietly. If tonight proved anything, it's that we can't wait for justice to find us. We have to make it. The convoy commander approached, his uniform still crisp despite the chaos. He saluted Michael, not as a courtesy, but as respect. Mr. Carter, he said, you'll want to be ready. The nation will want to hear from you. Michael nodded, though the weight of it pressed heavy on his chest. He wasn't sure if he was ready to become a symbol, but he was certain of one thing. Silence was no longer an option. Hours later, the videos flooded the internet. Clips of Simmons nearly drawing his weapon. Evelyn's words cutting through the night like fire. Michael holding up the warrant under the harsh glare of headlights. Millions watched, millions shared. The story could not be buried. By morning, the hashtag Warrant of Justice was trending across every platform. News anchors replayed the footage, civil rights leaders demanded reform, and even those who doubted could no longer dismiss what they had seen with their own eyes. But for Michael, the most powerful moment came not from the cameras or the headlines, but from the message that arrived on his phone just after sunrise. It was from a woman he didn't know, a mother in another state. My son watched your video last night, it read. For the first time, he said he wants to grow up. He believes he has a future. Thank you. Michael closed his eyes, the weight in his chest shifting into something else, not lighter, but stronger. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about every boy who thought he wouldn't make it home. Every mother who prayed for a phone call instead of a knock at the door. As dawn broke, Michael stood beside his mother. The night had shown them ugliness, but the morning revealed something greater. Resilience, courage, and the undeniable truth that even in the face of hate, justice could find its voice. And as the sun climbed higher, washing the town in gold, Michael spoke aloud the words that would echo far beyond the empty streets. This isn't the end, he said. This is the beginning. The story did not close with victory. It opened with responsibility. And to everyone watching, to everyone listening, to everyone who had ever been told to stay silent in the face of injustice, Michael's voice carried like a vow carved into stone. You may try to bury us in darkness, but we are the light, and we will not be silenced.